My name is Manmeet Kaur, and today's August 24th, 2014. I was just under a year old. We had just moved to, or soon after moved to Baldwin from Flushing, Queens.
Okay.
It was in the early 80s, and I should remember the year, but I don't, when they moved, but our especially Sangeet and life centered still quite a bit around Queens because Richmond Hill remained our primary Gurdwara for many years, and it's where most of our Sangeet was at the time. And so around that time we were either had moved or moved sometime after. So we lived basically between Queens and the border of Queens and Long Island.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, by that point, I believe my dad's entire family had moved to the U.S. and he has 6 siblings, so almost all of them were living in New York or had been transitioning to at least his immediate siblings and parents. On my mom's side, my Nanaji, Naniji still lived in Chandigarh, where they resided until they passed away over the last 2 to 3 years, and then my Masi ji and Masar ji lived in Patiala, and actually at the time they were probably stationed either in Pakistan or elsewhere. My Masar ji was a Major General in the Army, and a strong Sikh in the Indian Army who kind of was involved in a lot of border issues. But my Mama ji lived in Chandigarh, so my mom's family, 3 of her 4 siblings lived in India and 1 in Michigan. Not directly, but second cousins and extended family we do know of, but none of my direct uncles and aunts. Sure, my parents came in 1971, so they're one of the first Sikh families to have moved to New York, and I think even in the 70s, part of the reason why my dad wanted to leave was to be he didn't feel like there was a great future in India. He's often said when I asked him, why did you want to go to America? I think professionally and otherwise, from a Sikh perspective. But it was a huge part of growing up. I was only a year old, or less than a year old when it happened, but it was a huge part of our psyche, what was just, we had pro-Khalistan signs all over our house. My parents were part of starting the Richmond Hill Gurdwara, and very involved in Sikh Day parades, and I remember going to lots of parades, but most important, I think, just within our house. My father spoke about it. Since then, I don't think he has stopped talking about 1984, and any opportunity to talk about it to friends of ours, especially if they came from the Indian subcontinent, but professors, teachers, it was almost like you could separate the event and its identity from my dad's identity. Really embodied him, and he was very proud, as he should be, and as we are, of how much time he spent on media. I don't remember the number of hours, but I will ask him, because he certainly remembers that he spent on, speaking on NPR with the Leonard Lopez show. He wrote a number of articles about what the meaning of the 5 kakars are, and in various different journals and Sikh and Western media. And I directly didn't feel it. The most direct kind of visceral feeling I remember now actually feeling was in 93 when my mom, my brother, sister and I visited India, which was the first time I had gone since I was a year old, or a year and a half old. So I was 10 at the time, and we stayed for 2 months in Chandigarh, and my dad refused to join us, and he did not visit India again until I got married. So between leaving there in 71 until I got married in 2009, he refused to ever step on that subcontinent because of how much he hates the country, the government, and and basically has sort of cut it from his sense of identity. To the point where we would get yelled at as kids if we put South Asian on our identity for school. When you click the box of what your ethnicity is, we always had to write either Sikh, Punjabi, because he wanted nothing to do with the country. And the other, the 1993 story was we had visited and stayed there, but the day we went to visit the Golden Temple, her mandir side, my nanaji and mom and family refused to stay overnight because my brother was I think 16-year-old young male, and at that point it was still too dangerous to be lurking around Amritsar from their perspective. And so I remember this terrifying, one of the most visceral memories of that trip was this terrifying drive home at night on those on those extremely narrow roads with the trucks whizzing by, and just I couldn't sleep even though it was 2 a.m. and just squeezed on my mom and my brother's fingers as hard as I could because I was so scared. But they would refuse to stay there overnight. But we grew up with stories, and recently I have realized the degree to which I don't actually know all the stories in clear detail. The presence of the event was huge in our house, and the names of other uncles and aunties and families in the community at the time who were involved with organizing protests with my parents and who were involved with speaking out were very much a part of our household. But the specific stories, just even recently I was talking with Sean Virji and Bintu Virji and Ujadar uncle, who told me about how in 1982 Indira Gandhi paid a visit to Richmond Hill Gurdwara, and there were only 8 Sikhs, he said, who stood at the door and refused to welcome her and screamed in her ear and yelled and the jakaras, and the Sangat called the police. The police were there the entire time to make sure there would be no trouble amongst this 8 group of people who refused to welcome someone who they knew, even at that point, was dangerous to our community. And so that was quite an interesting story. And also to hear about another kind of funny story was my dad worked for the telephone company. It was Ma Bell. It became Verizon, AT&T, and then Verizon. And Sean Vijay was saying how he, growing up, used to wonder at one point when my dad lose his job, because all he knew was that my dad spent all his time using his phone lines to facilitate these free conference calls between groups of them to talk about their efforts. And he also he led an effort to start a publication in a group called the Panthik Cause. So the manifestations of his effort took many forms, from media to starting the Panthik Cause to, I think that was the full name of it, to organizing protests. And I have very strong images of the photographs in my mind of the black and white images of him in a lot of those marches. And then the present day culmination of that effort is also evident in this the volumes of books that are this large, of all the news clippings. And he was always very proud to share them with anyone who would come to visit. And I don't know of anyone in the community who kept as detailed record of every single piece of news that came out related to the event. But that's certainly a treasure for us as a Sangha to have long term. So it was quite a big part of my upbringing. And as an adult, especially when I was sort of studying South Asian studies as a student in college, I reflected upon my experience in my own household with the event, but also the effect that it had on the New York Sangat and U.S. Sangat of becoming such a strong. The effect of it on creating such a strong pro-Khalistan or separatist state in the U.S. Was incredible to see, and then also to learn about how events like this and tragedies in other countries have often a similar effect on the diaspora. And when I was 22 or 23, and I had the opportunity to live in India for a couple of months after college on a human rights fellowship. I was amazed at how people of his generation, and just every generation, it was like not it wasn't on their conscious in the way it was for every uncle and auntie that I knew growing up, and particularly my dad, in our home, and even with my grandparents. There's a lot of parts of their identity as Sikhs in India that shape who they are. And I think for my dad and a lot of other Sikhs his generation, even today when I recently visited, Richmond Hill Gurdwara and one of the large Toronto Gurdwaras, I think it's the largest one in Canada, we visited recently. I was struck by how there's still quite a large impact of 84 on the psyche and hearts and minds of a lot of our Sangit. And I think Prabjot, my husband, and I recently talked about how it'll be very interesting to see how our 2-year-old son and his generation think about what will they do about it. I think my parents were reacting to a tragedy in present day, and I was very motivated to become involved in social justice issues as a kid, which is sort of the career path that I took that is now more health focused, but always a big core part of my motivation in life. And I'm very excited to see how this next generation, who is not as close to the tragedy in their life, but it will certainly shape a lot of their identity, do with it. And I think the last thing I'll end on is it was fascinating to me to meet my husband, who grew up in Kenya until he was about 10, and whose grandparents migrated to Kenya pre-partition, and are part of another migration. He came to the U.S. with his parents when he was 10, and they moved around quite a bit, so it was hard for them to maintain a steady Sangat. But he didn't know about 1984 until his early 20s. He didn't know it was an event. And he grew up in a house where his father does Bhat and Prakash every day, and doing Bhat and remembering Nam was a big part of his upbringing, but it wasn't talked about. And so it's very interesting to kind of, as one grows up, see its impact on other people.